Good afternoon, Commissioners. Kathy Fitzpatrick, Coastal Engineer for the record, and I'm joined here with John Mayle and Dr. Jim Sullivan, who is the Executive Director of Harbor Branch Oceanographic Institution. I'm not going to take much time because I know it's late in the day, but I just want to say that Harbor Branch has been a partner with us for several years as we've gone through these blue-green algae issues. In 2016, they stepped up and really helped us understand what the problem was, the kinds of things that we needed to know, and helped us explain things to the people in the community. So with that, I don't know if John has anything else to add. I think we'll just let Dr. Sullivan take it away.
All right. I want to thank you all for having me come here. This is great. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the Florida Center for Coastal and Human Health, which Martin County has signed a memorandum of understanding with us. But before I talk a little bit about it at the end, I'm just going to give you a very brief lesson about harmful algae. I think it's important that for those of you who aren't scientists understand what we're dealing with in the state of Florida right now. So what are harmful algal blooms, or what we call HABs in terminology? They're just occurrences of what we call phytoplankton that cause negative ecosystem or human impacts. And if you look at this, these collage of photos in front of you, 3 of these came from Florida. The green one you're probably familiar with. That is the microcystis or cyanobacteria blooms that you typically have here in Martin County in the St. Lucie estuary. That actually is from the estuary. The 2 on the left side, one of them is Florida red tide, the top one, and the other one is the brown tide that's currently in the northern part of the lagoon. One of the nicknames for harmful algae has always been red tide, and the bottom right-hand image gives you a reason why. That's, it would traditionally it would discolor the water a red color, so that's why people would call them red tide. That's fallen out of fashion. We just call them harmful algal blooms these days. So what are phytoplankton? For those of you who aren't scientists, they're just simply microscopic plants. That's all you have to remember. They're just like a house plant, essentially. We call them algae in a vernacular. And they are plants, but as you see from this movie that's playing right now, they kind of skirt the world between plant and animals. So they actually have some characteristics of animals, like these can swim. These are modal. That's why when you see these slicks on the surface of the water a lot of times, it's because this algae is actually actively swam to the surface, and it aggregates and forms these slicks on the surface. And they're microscopic. As you can see, it says it's 50 microns. That's the diameter of your hair. So these things are very small, traditionally. How do these phytoplankton, or these harmful algal blooms that we have in the state of Florida, grow? Like I said, they're plants, and they just need 3 things to really bloom and grow. Like all plants, they need optimal light. The higher the light, generally the faster they grow. They need optimal temperature, and with most of these algae that form harmful algal blooms, the warmer the temperature, the faster they grow. And finally, they need optimal nutrients. Just like you have to fertilize your lawn or you fertilize crops, they're plants. They need nitrate and phosphates to grow. The more nutrients you give them, the more of them will grow, and that's what we call biomass. That's just how much of it's there. So more nutrients, more algae. How are they actually harmful to us? Almost all of you are probably familiar with the fact that these algae that we consider harmful algae, they make toxins. And these toxins are dangerous to us, and they're dangerous to wildlife as well. And there are a suite of toxins that different algae produce. But that's not the only way they're bad. This high biomass, when you have these big aggregations of this algae, and this is a picture actually from the St. Lucie estuary in Martin County of the cyanobacterial blooms. When that biomass sinks to the bottom and starts to die and decay, the bacteria that are eating it up essentially use the oxygen in the water. So it causes low oxygen or hypoxia, or even no oxygen, anoxia, and that's when you get a fish kill. So that's generally what you get at the end of an algal bloom. You can also imagine with a thick mat like this floating on the surface, the light that's coming down from above cannot penetrate to the bottom of the lagoon, or any water for that matter. So if you have seagrass beds, which are a really important ecological system in the lagoon and throughout most of the world for juvenile fish and other organisms, the seagrass dies. It has no light. It's like putting your houseplant in a dark closet. It's not going to survive. So the shading effect from the biomass of these blooms is really deleterious to our environment. They can also cause mechanical damage. A lot of these algae actually make mucus or surfactants, which clog the feeding apparatus of clams and shellfish. The surfactants can actually break down the oil in seabird feathers so that they die of hypothermia if they get exposed to it. And some of these algae actually have serrations on their cell walls, which will cut up fish gills, and the fish will bleed and die. Finally, the last one I think everyone here would be familiar with is the economic impact. When we have large harmful algal blooms, tourism and recreation are going to take a nosedive. No one's going to want to swim in this water that you would have in the county during one of these large blooms, nor should they, for that matter. Property values, you could see that go down. If this is in your backyard and you live on the waterfront, you might have a difficult time selling that house if this becomes the norm of what you see. And of course, it affects fisheries and other marine operations as well. So we are in the middle in Florida, not just in Martin County and the different counties in the state. The state as a whole is in an ecological and an economic crisis right now. And this is a really serious problem. And these are just some headlines from the past year. And just read through them. Florida tourism not seeing green as toxic algae chokes businesses. Water releases, algae threatening home values. There's your property thing. Toxic algae bloom is slaughtering marine life by the masses. It goes on. And the final one on the bottom are toxic algae blooms along Florida coast making people sick. These are not the headlines we want to see if we live in Florida or we're basing our economy on tourism. This is obviously a very serious problem. The reason this isn't going away is represented by this graph. Worldwide, this is not just a problem in Florida. This is going on across the entire globe right now. Harmful algal blooms are increasing not only in where we see them, we're seeing them in new places all over the world, but in the type of algae that are growing there, the frequency that they occur, how long they last, they can go on for years, and how severe they are. And if you look at this map, on the left-hand panel is harmful algal blooms that were reported in 1972 across the United States. The different symbols are for a different type of algae that actually occurred in that area. If you look at the one on the right, that's the condition we have now. It has radically changed between now and then. And this map is not even close to being up to date. These are just major algal blooms that have occurred. I mean, there are many small ones that never make the news and don't get reported on. And you can see I circle Florida. We have almost everything that goes on in the United States occurs in our waters somewhere.
We're number one.
And we're number one. And that's why I would say Florida is one of the most impacted states in the United States. We're on the front line for this problem, which is both good and bad.
Can I ask you a question, Doctor?
Yes, you can.
Based on that, if you could go back one slide.
Yep.
Now we have, the Atlantic Ocean on one side, the Gulf of Mexico, and do you find that some of these are issues that are starting in the water and working towards us, or is this all starting on land and working its way out?
Almost all of them start in the water and
work their way in.
The only type, and it's the type you actually have, one of the problems that you have in Martin County are the ones that start in freshwater bodies and then get into streams and waterways and then get into the marine environment. Most of these are coastal and marine problems, but almost all small freshwater bodies have harmful algae in them. That's just a fact of, a lot of nutrients get into our waterways, and these harmful algae tend to dominate even small ponds, canals, everywhere, Lake Okeechobee. But most of these originate in the ocean and then get into our coastal environment. So that is generally the way it happens. Does that answer your question?
It does. I was just looking at trying to look at the 1972 verse now, but then also to see, like along the West Coast and up like in Washington State, theirs in so many years, they went to also the light blue triangle, but is it some that are climactic? So, for instance, we have the warmer weather, so there's no, freeze that knocks some of these things down. How come it looks like we have every one of the categories, even though in the Northeast it looks like they do as well?
Yeah, and in some areas up, especially around the Gulf of Maine, in New England, they have...
so that eliminates the cold versus the warm concept.
The cold, what the warm does to us, it's doing two things, and I think I'm going to get to this in the next slide. Let me just check. Yeah, actually, I'll just do it as part of this. So why are they increasing? That's what you're basically asking. Why is this happening? So there's probably three main reasons. One is eutrophication, or what we commonly call nutrient pollution. So this is the major thing. Again, they're plants. More nutrients, more algae. You're just going to fertilize them, they're going to go. But the second one is more what you were trying to get at. Global warming and climate change. And the two ways we're being affected is the warming increases the growth rates that we know from laboratory work, and we know they'll grow faster, but it's increasing the range of a lot of these algae now. So algae that could not survive in our water over a long period of time, the winter does knock them down, so they're not continuous throughout the year. Here, because of the temperatures, they can remain continuous. They don't get knocked down by the winter. Where up in the northern states and up in the Pacific Northwest, yeah, when the winter comes, it tends to knock them down. But they'll come back when the summertime comes. But algae that, would be Caribbean algae, we're getting tropicalization in Florida. So we're actually seeing warmer and warmer, climate zones move up through the state. That allows hardiness of plants. Like you can grow certain plants that you couldn't grow in Florida before. You can start growing in the middle part of the state. That's true of algae, too. There are now algae that can come up into our waters that never could persist here before because it's warm enough for them to go. Algae in general, we're seeing a spread of a lot of different species throughout the world's oceans because of nutrient pollution primarily. We keep on fertilizing it. They get introduced into our water through ballast discharge or some other way. They get spread, and then they make a home in your local water because you're feeding them well, essentially, putting it in layman's terms. The other thing with climate change is, our precipitation changes. We have more severe storms or we get more rain. That changes runoff, which changes nutrient pollution and how much nutrients get in. Drought sometimes changes which algae might take over. The last one I don't have time to go into, but as humans, we do a lot of modifications to the coastlines and our ecosystems, which all can exacerbate which algae can then take over. The depressing thing is it's actually forecast to get worse than it is now. So as you looked at that map, the National Climate Assessment just came out about a month ago from the government, and one of the major conclusions they put in it was that red tide will become more common in Florida. And they just didn't mean Florida's red tide. They mean harmful algal blooms. They're not just talking about one thing. They're talking about all of them are going to get worse. And that is, again, because of that warming and climate change and what it does to our problems. So this graph is kind of busy, but these are the current harmful algal bloom threats we have in South Florida. Many of these are going on actively right now. So most of you are probably familiar with the two big red circles. That's what we call Florida red tide. That's Karenia brevis. It makes a toxin called brevetoxin. If you went down to the beach last October, you were probably coughing if it was out there. It's a respiratory irritant, but it's actually a neurotoxin. It affects your brain. The other one you're obviously familiar with is the microcystis cyanobacteria blooms that start in Lake Okeechobee and find their way to the coast through discharges. But look at this list. There are a host of other algal blooms going on right now in Florida, and particularly in the Indian River Lagoon. There are blooms that have been going on for decades that are consistently there. The brown tide has been going on since 2012. It's still there just as strong as it was in 2012. It has not dissipated. Now, because of all these different algae, it's not just one, there's all these different HAB toxins and effects. So depending on which algae happens to be growing in your local water, you could have paralytic shellfish poisoning, diuretic poisoning, neurotoxic poisoning, amnesic poisoning, and ciguatera, which is a common fish poisoning you can get. And you can get it through a lot of different ways, through drinking water contamination, through breathing it in when it aerosolizes like the Florida red tide typically does, from eating contaminated seafood and or freshwater fish that bioaccumulate the toxins in them, or simply just going in the water and recreating in it. Both pets and humans should not recreate in water that has cyanobacteria in it, for instance. That's very dangerous to do. When you're exposed to these toxins, there's two effects. There's that acute impact where it's an immediate and this, typical severe response. You feel sick. Like when the red tide occurred here, if people went down into the beaches, their eyes would start to water, they might cough, they wouldn't feel good. They know, get away. I've been acutely exposed to a toxin, they get away. And we understand that for most of these toxins. If you eat a contaminated fish, your lips will start getting numb. You'll start feeling ill. You've just ingested a toxin. What we don't know about are the chronic impacts. People are exposed to these toxins at lower levels year after year, and we have no clue what this is doing to their health. I mean, we honestly do not. And we need a lot more research with that, and I'll get to that in a moment. So I'm going to give you the one example. I could go through and have in lectures all the different algal blooms, how they originate, what their problems are to both humans and the environment. But I'll talk about the one that has the most implications to Martin County. So you're all aware of the very large cyanobacterial blooms, I would assume you are, that regularly occur in Lake Okeechobee during the summer. So this is from May to November. It's pretty much going to be there. Some years it's much worse than others, but it's pretty much always there. And this picture is a satellite shot from Landsat, and that green slick you see in the middle of the lake, that's the size of this bloom. I mean, Lake Okeechobee is big. This is a large biomass of algae. Now, obviously, this is an issue when they do discharges, but Microcystis, as an algae, produces what's called a hepatotoxin. This is a liver toxin. It will essentially destroy your liver. It'll give you liver disease and eventually liver failure if you ingest enough of this toxin. And it can do it in both humans and animals that are exposed to it. So as you know, during the lake discharges in our rainy season, if there's a bloom going on in the lake, it's coming into Martin County, and it's going to come through C-44. And it also goes to the west coast of the Caloosahatchee. And this picture on the right there is actually a picture, again, that's taken from Martin County. That was down by Central Marina, somewhere down there, during 2016, I believe. And I believe you had a state of emergency declared during 2016. You didn't do it during 2018, did you? Yes, you did. Oh, okay. And you had to put up signs like this. So that's a Martin County sign, and it's really good to tell people avoid contact with the water. And hopefully people follow those warnings, but it's very serious. The reasons it's serious is there is some evidence that these blooms are not just causing this environmental and this economic problem, but there may be a direct human cost to the populations of Florida or people that are exposed to them. This report came, it's a headline from Health News Florida. It was done by Ohio State, and they looked at clusters of non-alcoholic liver disease and exposure to cyanobacteria blooms that create microcystin, a hepatotoxin, destroys your liver. And they found out 4 counties made up a cluster with high rates of deaths from non-alcoholic liver disease and algal blooms. Now, the important thing is here, this was a correlation study. This was not a study of measuring toxin in people's body who died. They just looked at the number of deaths from non-alcoholic liver disease and how it correlated to the exposure of cyanobacteria in that area. Now, what's interesting is the 4 counties of Indian River, Martin, St. Lucie, and Okeechobee. And we always say correlation is not causation in science. Just because something correlates does not mean that's the actual cause. But as a scientist, it's obviously disturbing, and it should be disturbing to the public. The one thing I want to say, and I've heard this by people in public saying this during testimony or the recent Corps of Engineers public forum, that doctors know specifically, and they have proof, that certain cancers or liver disease or whatever the health ailment is, that there is a demonstrated cause and effect from these algal blooms. We do not know that. We honestly do not. So if someone is saying that publicly, ask them for the proof, because we don't know. We don't have that evidence. It's exactly why we're trying to do research to establish that connection. You can do a study like this and look at a correlation, but that does not prove that that's what did it. As a scientist, it's scary, and as a person who lives in these counties, it's scary. But we need to be sure before we tell the public this is, what their real risk is. So I would caution you on, if someone's saying they have proof that these algal blooms did this, ask them for the proof.
Can we for 1 second, please?
Yep.
Doctor, can we go back that one slide just to your image?
Yep. Which one?
No, back there, that one.
Yep.
So the red cubes are the ones that were identified?
Yep.
So the 2 lower ones are Miami-Dade and Broward.
Right.
The next white box is Palm Beach. The next white box is Martin.
So the four red, the red ones, and I'm sorry for that's a blurry thing, but the four red ones are St. Lucie, Martin, Okeechobee, because it goes over towards the lake, and then Indian River is the northern one. Those are the only ones. That's a map out of that actual study that was done, and that was the only counties that showed up this positive correlation.
That's not all of Martin County. Right,
right.
The big, what Commissioner Smith is saying, you've missed half of our county.
Well, no, this is out of the scientist paper.
They missed
it. They colored it wrong. Anyway.
If they colored it wrong, that's fine.
But no, in the text, they've cited Martin County. Those are the four. I mean, that's why you can see it. I actually took someone who summarized the article and wrote an article on it. So, yeah.
When we show people stuff and tell people stuff, it's like, okay, I don't know if that's Martin or not.
Oh, no, trust me. I mean, they wrote it in the study. So anyway.
Just northern Martin, like Jensen, not Hope Sound or Palm City.
Right.
Yeah.
What's the green, just for curiosity?
That was an area where, if I remember right, they saw something that was possibly a correlation, but it wasn't statistically strong enough that they would actually take it. So it's like, and with doing health data like these kind of analysis, it's very difficult to find a really strong correlation. When you do, it becomes a cluster. We find clusters like this all the time with Alzheimer's. Different cancers pop up, and then people start to scurry around trying to find out what was the cause. Why did we see so many people with this typical disease that they found in an area? So when they found this, they did this for the entire United States, not just Florida. And this was the only counties in Florida that actually showed this correlation. That's why I would not take this very seriously. Again, correlation is not causation. So just to get to the end, what are we doing at Harbor Branch? So with a initial seed donation from the Harbor Branch Foundation, we've started what's called the Florida Center for Coastal and Human Health, which you have signed an MOU with. The point of this is that we want to bring together all the expertise that we have at FAU and Harbor Branch and bring in both public and scientific partners and stakeholders, gather all that expertise together so we can start to understand this HAB crisis much better than we currently do and really start to understand what the true risks to our population are and what the impacts are with hard science, not just correlation studies.
I'm sorry, just once again, too. So you mentioned earlier that if we had had doctors in the community that had said X, but X really isn't provable.
It's provable, but only with a serious medical epidemiological study.
Okay, so I'm just curious, in this group of folks, have we invited the now newly named Cleveland Martin Health folks into the discussion?
We are trying to sign. We were very close, and that was, you'll see on one of the following slides. We're pretty close to having a MOU signed with Martin Health, right. But when the Cleveland Clinic merger started to take over, that kind of complicated it. So I think we're still in the process of doing it, but now it has to go beyond what we originally talked to Martin Health about.
So just as a thought, just as a break point here, we might want to send a letter to the new Cleveland folks and Martin folks asking them to put it higher on their prioritization list, that because I think it would be important if the first line of defense folks are going to be our doctors and people are going to go to the emergency ward, they got to be told the same information that you're telling us or the people are telling us, so that
we don't want to scare people.
Well, no, we're doing a pretty good job of it, but I think it would be important that the information ought to be consistent.
Yes.
Whether they're hearing it here or they're hearing it from an emergency ward, whatever that information is. But I think it would be great for us to, at least for this issue, to if it has been maybe pushed a little bit to the side somewhere, that we send a letter to them saying that we would at least, it would be helpful for them to rise it to the top maybe of their priorities at least.
Oh, we would love, personally, I would love if you could do that, because we would like to engage them. I mean, they collect that frontline data with people coming into the emergency room that we can actually use as part of an epidemiological study. So it's actually important that we work together on this, and we can inform them about, hey, here's what we know, here's what we're studying, because we're actively doing epidemiological work now on the populations.
So I doubt that we need a motion, Mr. Chair, but can the chair, or can we put a letter together for the chair to sign from the commission to Cleveland Clinic Martin requesting that?
Absolutely.
Okay, I'm just asking.
That would be great. Yeah, and ultimately what we want to get to is what we all want. We want to have a healthy environment. We want a healthy population. We want to know our risks. We shouldn't be scared of it, but we need to understand what our true risks are. We don't need to scare people unnecessarily. It is scary, but within reason. So as part of this kind of leads just what you were talking about. As part of the center, what we're trying to do and what I do a lot of is recruiting public stakeholders. So Martin County has signed an MOU with us. St. Lucie is going to sign theirs. I've talked to all their county commissioners as well. They're going to sign, I believe, in a week. They're going to put it up in front of their county commission board. I'm also working with Indian River County. I'd like to get the whole Treasure Coast, obviously. Martin Health System, this is now out of date. We were very close. Now it's Cleveland Clinic. We have signed an MOU with SBDC. We're working with the SBDC and Indian River State College right now to do an economic impact study from the harmful algal bloom. So that's also work we're doing under this center where we want to know what is it doing, and what did it do when it occurs every year? How much is it affecting business here in tourism? As part of what we really need to do, the important science side, is we need to recruit strategic research partners too. There is very limited money to do a lot of this work. I mean, science is always underfunded no matter what you're doing. We don't have the luxury of people repeating the same work. So we're trying to get people to come together and coordinate their research, coordinate our messaging to the public. So I have pretty much talked to everyone all these different organizations that you see on here. Orca has signed an MOU with us. They're a nonprofit that works in Fort Pierce. The Smithsonian, UF, we have a joint project with right now. 4Ocean, the people who remove plastic from the oceans, gave us money towards our center to do research. The CDC is processing some of the samples that we took from Martin County residents, actually. So we're actively trying to grow this and leverage the scientists who can do this kind of work and generate the science we actually need. And this is...
One second, please.
Yep.
Sorry,
Commissioner Smith.
I keep asking questions. So 6 months ago, 8 months ago or so, our former senator, our former senator, I guess, had a request that had been forwarded to just about every federal agency that existed, asking for their involvement and help. Do we need to do something from our level of this, more of an ask from our federal folks in terms of funding, in terms of just help? Who are you on that end, or is this, and I don't say merely, but are you focusing only at the local level, meaning state level, or should we also?
No, as a matter of fact, it's not that it's easy, but it's probably easier for us to get federal money. So NOAA right now, and they're one of the major people that sponsors harmful algal bloom research, they've put out a call. I think they're there's $9 million available across the United States in a program called EcoHab, which is to study the ecology of harmful algal blooms. They also have a program called MERHAB, which is to study new technology to monitor harmful algal blooms. You actually wrote a letter of support. We just put in a proposal to the MERHAB program, and we're putting in 2 proposals to the EcoHab program. So that federal money is there. And because of Florida's basic, the amount of publicity as the state got this year, the federal government responded by putting more money into these programs. Some years they're not funded at all. So that has had, is it enough? No, it is not enough. Okay. FAU, as our lobbyists, are actually up in D.C. this week trying to shake out more money.
What would be really helpful, because we go up there fairly regularly, is if we could somehow jointly get an ask that we need to be focusing on. So if it's more money, if it's like we really need $20 million and not $9 million, and $15 million of that really needs to be spent in Florida alone. Yeah. It would be helpful to have that, so that on our next trip up there, we can be talking to them and focusing on, like, here are our 3 things we're really dealing with right this minute, and this is one of them.
I can give you I'm developing actually, so it's really good timing. I gave some bullet points to our lobbyists, but I'm developing a white paper this week to basically go over, here's where we need funding, here's what we need supported.
That would
Now,
be awesome.
I can give it to you. It's just as good in your hands as it is in our lobbyists' hands.
Well, I collectively, I mean, you know, we have staff that do that, and half of them are sitting here, and others are out doing other things. But we always go up there with a purpose. Usually, it's on one issue or another issue, but there's 2 or 3 things that creep into that purpose. And so, if there is a direct ask that Indian River, St. Lucie, Martin, Okeechobee, whoever can have coordinated. So when you're talking to these folks about getting your MOUs and stuff, if we can get that outline of here are the 3 agencies we ought to be requesting specific either financial requests or technical help or whatever that is, we would love to have that.
Yeah, and that would be great, and I'll do it. I would even take it a step further. It might be good for you to actually talk to our lobbyists, if you're willing to, just to tell them that, hey, the county supports your lobbying efforts, and that they know at least that you do, because they can use that when they're up there.
Separate DC from Florida, or are they one and the same?
Oh, no, we have separate lobbyists that go work in Tallahassee versus DC. So,
right, sure.
And you know, the state is another place where, you know, I'm encouraged by what I've seen. It looks like there's going to be some investment in research, but as much pressure can be brought to bear in Tallahassee to support this kind of stuff and keep it going, that helps too. Every little bit helps. And not just for us, for everyone trying to do this work. You know, it's not, I don't want to be selfish and say it's all coming to us.
Dr. Sullivan, how many more slides do you have?
I have this one. That was it. That's the last one. Because
the band is about to start playing.
Okay. Anyway, we're doing a lot of research right now. Kathy talked a little bit about how we've helped the county in the past. We're measuring toxin in the water regularly. We're monitoring your waters right now for harmful algae. We're looking at how toxins are getting into the food chain. And as I said, if you look at that one slide, a little cutout in the very bottom middle, we're actually starting to test people directly for the amount of toxin in them with blood, urine, and nasal swab samples, people that are occupationally or recreationally exposed to these blooms that occur in the water. So that's critical. We need that kind of information. So that's where we need research. And that's it.
Jim, I have one question, because I know the samples have been submitted to CDC, and for quite a while you were having trouble getting those analyzed. What's the status on that?
So as far as I know, I think they're in the process of being done now. There was a holdup between the state. The CDC wouldn't do it unless the state officially asked them to do it. So there was a disconnect between Governor Scott apparently asking the CDC for help. The money was there because Senator Nelson and Senator Rubio actually got the money for the CDC to do that processing for Florida. But you know, government. I heard someone say, government's sometimes difficult.
So, are we back on track, or do we?
I think we're back on track. I mean, some of the analysis we do at Harbor Branch. So the nasal stuff we actually do, and we've already run all those tests. But we need to get the stuff for the CDC done. Last I heard, I thought it was on track to be done. So I can find out.
So can we just add that, Kathy, to our list of questions?
Sure.
Anything else for the doctor? Sir, that was an excellent presentation. I think that it's first off, it's difficult for the public to hear it because they just hate it. And secondly, it's very technical, and I thought you brought it down to a level that people can get it. Would you be willing to allow us to put this slide presentation on our website?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
I think that would be a nice thing. Maybe make it a hot topic for a week or so the people that are specifically wanting to follow up from this meeting might be able to find it easier. Commissioner Smith, why don't you chime in?
Well, what might be helpful is that his narrative goes along with it, because if it's just a slide presentation.
Right, so the snippet of this portion of the agenda. Excellent suggestion.
Mr. Smith, not Mr.
Commissioner Smith.
Leave out all the sarcasm.
Anything else?
No.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. That was great.
Safe travels back home. Our next agenda item is departmental number 1. Office of Budget.